I think another thing that somebody said, it was a different pastor, and he said, you're going to be really surprised by who leaves you in the process. And it was like, nah, you were probably surprised by who left you, but I'm not going to be surprised by who left me. And yet, of course I was.
James Dieter. So good to see you today. So good to sit down and have this conversation today. I've been wanting to do this for a while. This is our second conversation. The first one took place 6 years in to your church planted Renewal City Church almost 12 years ago. So we sat down about 6 years ago and just talked about what it was like growing up in a Christian family, and with all the expectations that come with you're going to somehow be a leader of a church, and somehow you became the guy who was out of your family that was going to be the church leader, the pastor, and what that was like, what that felt like. I'd like to take a little bit different tack today. You're in a unique position because you have been pastoring long enough. I think there's some statistics say that if you can make it past 10 years, you're probably going to do pretty well, but a lot of guys fade out around 10 years because of the stress and the cost to their family, and it's just a difficult job. And so you didn't know that? You're looking like you're surprised at that one. Then you're thinking back about, what was I like at 10 years then? So you made it past that, and now you're kind of heading into that next phase. But I'd like to look back a little bit about how being a leader of a church has impacted you personally. We all start out in different places for different reasons. You and I were at a different place when we started. In fact, when you were going to plant the church, you came and talked to me, and I tried to talk you out of it. Because part of that is if you really want to do it, you're not going to let anything or anybody talk you out of it. And so it's a kind of a good thing to be confronted with that whole thing. There's a way out. You want out before we start. And you were pretty determined that this is what God called you to do, and you were going to do it. And now I'm interested how it's changed you. I mean, we all mature, we all evolve, but how has pastoring for the last almost 12 years changed who you are? What was it like in the beginning? Let's start there. Do you remember how you felt?
Yeah, I remember I felt really sure that I was doing what the Lord called me to do. I think I just turned 30, and I felt really sure about a lot of things at 30. I think 30 is a great age because you have a little bit of adult life experience, and you're still pretty young and healthy and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and the future is, feels wide open. And then I'm now in my 40s, and you start to wonder, have I already lived half my life? And the time feels short, and what am I doing with my time? And is my life significant?
Your kids are getting older.
Yeah, kids are getting older. Are they going to need me much longer? My hope is that they won't, but that's a two-edged sword.
Just to clear that up in case they watch this.
Yeah, just in case. They probably won't. Sorry, what was the question?
How did it feel when you first started?
When I started, we had a honeymoon phase of a church plant. It was, we threw this out there to some friends, some family. We feel like the Lord's calling us to do this. And people were enthusiastic out of the gate and felt a similar calling, were really excited about having a chance to be leaders in their own right, to serve in certain ways, to be the people who get to make decisions. And so, yeah, for the first few years, we were we were just cruising along, and it felt like everything we did was wonderful. And so,
Do you feel like you're ready? Prepared well?
no, I think life had prepared me well. There's just a lot that I didn't know. There's a lot of assumptions I made about, there's a lot of assumptions I made about people's reliability, people's longevity, people's commitment, unwavering. I'm still here after almost 12 years, and there's a number of people who are still here after 12 years, but there's more of us who aren't than who were. And
do you ever think about the fact that, we're all susceptible to comparison. You're comparing the way that you feel, and you obviously are all in. I mean, you're making sacrifices, you're moving things out of the way so you can do this and this alone. And nobody else is in that position but you.
Yeah.
They're all partially in.
Yeah.
But the feeling is, like you say, the honeymoon, they're all in.
Yeah.
They're not. They're not all in.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and I think I was naive to some of those realities, and because it really, for a while, it just felt like, man, this is the biggest thing going on in anyone's life around here, and then gradually it's like, oh, these people are moving, these people are doing this, these people think that other church might be a better fit for them, and so people move on, and you go through a period of time where you...
And apparently you can't.
Well, I could have, but I never did, at least not yet. And so, over a course of time, it started to feel, I think, a little lonely. It started to feel like, gosh, does anybody care? Are these sacrifices worth it? And those kinds of things. And so... it's a wonder in some ways that we're still here doing it. So,
yeah. Well, I think that perspective, you have to do it a while before you get there. Mm-hmm. It's not easy. Like, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And then you have these experiences, and still, this is going to sound like a total plug for City Serve, but I don't know how you do this without talking to somebody else who has had those feelings and walked that path and felt what it was like to have a picture of the church like you just described. Like, I'm all in. Why isn't everybody else all in?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think that feeling, even the naivety. So I go into it, I felt really embraced by the pastors in the community, and like, oh, great, here's James to, serve alongside us, and we're all going to do this together. And for a few years it was great, but similar to people in the congregation that disappeared, like pastors around town started disappearing. And it turned out that the calling to Longview was just a temporary calling, or, that the grass was greener somewhere else. Or, there was a couple of pastors I was walking with who, I think at least one whose congregation folded, while he was there. And so people go through hard things, and then you look around and you're like, well, I wanted to do this together, but together seems like it gets smaller every year. And so you have to start making new friends. And I think I'm at a stage now where I've gone through several rounds of new friends, several rounds of investing in relationships and wanting to walk together. And it seems like the Lord's opening up yet another round of it. And you go, okay, how do I give myself genuinely and freely in friendship? How do I behave in an open way toward people and not a guarded way toward people, when my experiences have maybe taught me that guardedness would be better. Guardedness would be safer for me, for my family, and maybe one of the reasons I'm still in it is because I'm slow to learn those kinds of things. I still am naive to, I think I just don't feel like people are going to let me down.
Yeah.
I just feel like people are going to come through.
And then you're surprised when they don't.
Yeah. Genuinely surprised and then quick to just kind of, make excuses for them and move on. And,
and all the while, good things are happening.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it can sound kind of like we're painting a negative picture of what's going on, but this is just kind of like, I feel like it's behind the scenes.
Yeah. In
front, what everybody sees and everybody hears is an excitement about teaching the word, an excitement about reaching people who don't know Jesus yet, an excitement about seeing people grow in their relationship with Jesus. And it's incremental, but there's still always people who are growing.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are even miracles that happen, and we celebrate those.
Yep.
And
yeah.
You look at the bank account for the church, and it's still fluid, and that's almost a miracle at times when you go through things like COVID. It's like, so there are good things that are happening all the time, but behind the scenes, there's this feeling like, if I don't do this, is it going to happen?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I think maybe for me, it's at least in this season, it's more of a does it matter that I do this? Does anybody care?
Yeah.
And partly because, like you said, this church thing's it's my life. It's my livelihood. It's a huge part of my week. It's a huge part of every one of my days. And for a lot of people, it's just where they're hanging out for a couple hours on a Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's easy to change. Or maybe they're doing more than that. Maybe they're Sunday morning and they got some small groups and they got a few friends. But even those things can change in life. And so, and I think every time that somebody makes a change in that and you're still left, holding the bag, you're like, well, maybe for me, because I can constantly think, well, I love this place. Why wouldn't other people love it too?
Yeah.
And I think I know why, I could tell you why people don't like it, but
yeah. Well, then there's this other POV that is, how does God feel about it?
Yeah.
And it almost is kind of rattling when you go that direction and think, he's pleased with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's really pleased that you haven't stopped doing this.
Yeah.
Not that he's depending on you, and if you don't do it, nobody else would do it, but he's just pleased with you.
Yeah.
How does it feel to know that the God of heaven is your boss?
Yeah, he's a really good boss. I think especially when I've gone through different challenges in different years or had anxieties about things. Oh, it's May and we're in the red on the budget. What's going to happen? Or it's these people left because, somebody came to church that they didn't think should be there, or things like that. And so you have moments of feeling really discouraged and maybe feeling a little bit like you could be doing a better job.
Yeah.
And to have a boss who assures you that he loves you, that he's pleased with you, that while you could do better, he's not firing you. You're the one he's working for, he's the one you're working for. And so those kinds of assurances, I suppose in many ways it's the only thing that keeps me doing it. I don't know why you would pastor a church if you didn't feel really called to it.
Yeah.
It's a pretty demanding and thankless gig in many ways, at least the way I do it.
Yeah.
Maybe if if the content I produce is more publishable or something like that, there might be some great financial incentive or fame incentives in it, but
you could always play for the NBA too.
Yeah. I could have, but the way it is, it's like there's not a whole lot of ego stroking happening. There's not a whole lot of what looks or feels really successful. There's just a lot of staying in it with people, celebrating the moments of beauty and redemption in their lives, and mourning the moments of loss and brokenness. And so, Yeah. Which, I could do that. Well, I got paid to do something else. Yep. So it's kind of like, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know why anyone would.
Yeah. I've been down that road before, and the Lord reminded me gently, well, then what do you need me for?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reality is we need him for all this.
Yeah.
The fact that we don't stop or don't do something other than this because it would be easier.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, you mentioned you could always do things better. How do you manage that between your ears? That reality that, I mean, especially now, because you go on podcasts and see people who do what you do it at a really high level.
Yeah.
It's not like for most pastors in the 60s and 70s, they were listening to their own voice about 90% of the time. And every once in a while they get a cassette tape of somebody else, but they couldn't see pastors in action who were working at a really high level like we can. I imagine, it can make you feel like, there are times when I'm listening to somebody and commending them on what they're doing, and my wife will say, "You're as good as they are." And I'm like, I appreciate the fact that you say that, but I know the truth. What do you do with the fact that you're not, you could do better?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. I think when I talk about doing better, I'm usually talking about points in a relationship where maybe where I should have confronted and I didn't. Maybe where I should have apologized and I didn't. Maybe where I should have reached out and I didn't.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm pretty aware, and I really value the relational side of ministry and aware of like the faults that I have on that side. I'm kind of unapologetically bad at graphic design. I don't care. If you're coming to see the slides that I put together, you're not going to stick around very long because they're pretty pitiful. I try to use them a little bit because people are always like, "Oh, it's really nice to have something to look at," but I'm not great at it, and our live stream is just one camera angle, and it's a little fuzzy because I wasn't going to spend 3 times the amount of money for a camera that took a little fuzz out of it, and so that polishedness, yeah, we're not super polished. That's just not what we do, and I'm okay with that part. Yeah, we could definitely be better. People have been saying for years they need more information. We need more information, and I only started believing it in the last couple of years. And so I've really tried to, when we're doing an event or planning for something, and people are, I'm like, just let me put the blindfold on, you walk off that plank. Like, what do you mean you want more information? But so there's some things, more practical things that there's room for improvement. But
you're right, though. The thing I've found over the years is that most of the complaints people have about me and the way I lead are not what I do, but they're what I don't do, what I forget to do, what I overlook, what I ignore. I've gotten into so much trouble ignoring things that were right in front of me that I should have taken care of, and I just didn't at the time. So I think that as far as other people's opinions about your leadership, it's really difficult to do everything all the time and do it well, as far as the relational part of it. I think that's really true. Do you think there's any way, looking back now, is there anything that you think would have helped that process? Being more aware of what's going on. Would it have helped if you had someone on like a staff member that you could walk with and say, "How are we doing?" instead of "How am I doing?"
Yeah, probably should have done therapy when I was younger. I feel like a lot of it has to do with areas of self-awareness, right? And you don't realize that, I'm someone who avoids conflict until you do enough work in a room with somebody to tell you, gosh, you really avoid conflict, don't you? And then you talking about the things you ignore, like, yeah. yeah, I'll ignore stuff forever and just hope it gets better. And I have kind of an optimistic disposition that just thinks it's going to get better.
Yeah.
Like, of course, these people are following Jesus. Of course they would decide to lay down their offenses and just get along. Like, why wouldn't they? Yeah. So what would have helped? I should have probably waited till I was a little older before I started a church.
Really?
Maybe. I don't know.
I think there's something about doing it before you're ready
Yeah.
that is really, really beneficial to the church. Because then you grow. I mean, like, I don't know what it would be. Maybe it'd be the same thing to go through Bible college and then seminary and finish seminary and feel like I've done everything they want me to do and I think I'm ready. And I didn't feel like that at all, ever. I still don't feel like that. I still feel like the best things that happened to me in ministry happened because Jesus loves me and Jesus loves them, and he's able to do some pretty spectacular things with those equations. And not because I was necessarily all that big of a help to him. I think the biggest help that we add to the process is that we just don't quit.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really hard not to, because the weight of it is really heavy. I mean, you have the church, but you've got a family too. Your wife and how she feels and how she's responding to all this. Your kids and wondering whether or not they're going to make it through this whole process that you're thriving at least on the outside.
Yeah.
And they're having to figure out how to navigate. And those are some great conversations to have with your kids. Have you ever asked your kids what kind of a pastor they think you are?
I don't think so. No, I'm thinking like I know that at least a couple of my kids have said complimentary things about the leader that I think I am, that they think I am. But I don't know that we've ever really dialogued about it and gotten to the heart of it. And I think, my oldest is 17, and then we go down 15 and 12 after that. I think that in many ways, it's like they're becoming adults themselves right now. And so, they'll have probably some really good insights.
It's hard to do. For what it's worth, I didn't do it either.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some revelations I've had after 30 years that I didn't even come close to it 15 or 20. So
yeah.
You do learn a lot, especially in the, between 20 and 30 years. I learned a lot about myself, got much more relaxed about who I was. And because I started at 34, so started about pretty much the same time you did. But there's just a lot of things you learn about yourself. There's a lot of things you learn that you don't necessarily think are all that bad. Like why do I work so hard to be like somebody else when I'm really not that bad, just the way I am? And I think sometimes that's one of the biggest helps we can be to each other is, I just don't think there's any replacement for walking with other pastors as you're pastoring. I know it's hard. I know it takes time. It feels kind of shallow a lot of times. It seems like you're just, talking about stuff. But it also gives you an opportunity to talk about some things that you wouldn't talk with anybody else. So it's kind of a hard sell, but I think it's worth talking about the fact that we have a lot that we can bring to each other. I've never fixed any of your problems. You've never fixed any of my problems, but that's not the reason why we spend time together.
Yeah, I mean, at risk of sounding like a commercial for CityServe, I think there really is some great value in working together and developing friendships and relationships where you can talk about that kind of stuff. And I think without those relationships with other pastors in the community, or even some of those relationships with just people in my congregation who I can share my heart with, it makes a big difference. And then I think the beauty of like your and my relationship is you're a lot older than I am. But you have that perspective of, hey, have you ever thought about asking your kids about this? Because I never did, and I wonder what they, what they would say. And so there's a great benefit in that too. I know when I started, I was sitting down with a number of different pastors and people that were on my list to talk to about church plant and what are your thoughts and what should I know, and I don't remember who it was, but one person made a big point about I really need to watch people and value the people who respond really well when you do something they don't like or don't do it their way, right? So people who bring you ideas and you shoot them down, or you ask them to do your idea and they tell you it's not a great idea, but then they help you do it anyways. And what a great piece of advice, because those people have been invaluable in our community over the last 12 years. People that will come and the most valuable people are those people who, because there's a depth. They're not just yes people. They're people who will let you know that they don't agree, or let you know that this was a bad idea, but they're also loyal people. And so they're humble enough to do it your way, and humble enough to stay in it, even when we did it your way really didn't work.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I should have listened to you, to walk through that whole thing. And I think another thing that somebody said, it was a different pastor, and he said, you're going to be really surprised by who leaves you in the process. And it was like, nah, you were probably surprised by who left you, but I'm not going to be surprised by who left me. And yet, of course I was, there's people who I thought, I had friends at one point who were talking about moving out of the city, and it was like, oh man, that would just be the worst. I couldn't imagine them moving away and having to do renewal without their help and without them being a part of it, and it just seemed like the worst thing that could ever happen. And they didn't take the job, they didn't move, but they eventually, went through some heartache, quit coming to church, got tired of people. And so I thought the worst thing would be that they moved. The worst thing is that we still hang out, but they don't come to renewal anymore. Yeah. And I see them around town, or we do things together from time to time, and it's just heartbreaking. Oh man.
I listen to podcasts of people who aren't Christians necessarily. It keeps you sharp, because it keeps you aware of what you believe and what you think is true. There are an amazing number of people who are not believers, who are not Jesus followers anyway. They may believe in God, but they are touting the power and the value of religion in people's lives. The church always says that. Yeah, we need to be in community. We have to be in community. Community is really important. But when you hear people who are not even Christians say, I see the world without religion, I think I like it better with. I think one guy who's a philosopher, I forget who it was, but he said, you people in the church need to get back to work. You have something really valuable here. You don't need to apologize for trying to get people to live in community, because it's really valuable for them. Living in isolation, being lonely is really hard right now. So even from a societal, cultural standpoint, I think there's some push back into spiritual communities, which is going to be weird if people start coming back, not because they're after something we have, but because somebody told them they would be missing out.
Yeah.
It just seems like there's a pull back into spirituality in a way that there wasn't 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, and that might be, I think at the same time, Christian communities just have a way of disappointing each other, wounding each other. And if you're a generation that is convinced you need church in your life to be faithful to Christ, then you figure out a way to keep going. But for people who maybe come from a generation that they feel like, well, I don't know that Western capitalistic version, 300 people sitting in a chair listening to a guy preach, rock band. Like, I don't even know that that's church. Things happen, they get disappointed, they get let down, they get hurt, and they're like, I don't need to do this. I don't need to do this at all.
Yeah.
And those are the people that I think of that kind of give up, become de-churched, and I think, I know different ones. They still pray. They still read the scripture. They still, they probably do a lot of online kind of church because, they get content that way.
How do you feel about all that personally?
I think sometimes I feel like, but we're different at Renewal. Don't lump us in with, all the transgressors. Like we follow a Savior who is counted with transgressors, but we don't want to ever be grouped in with them. So there's that, there's the personal, just like the rejection that you feel when somebody
doesn't want what you have.
Yeah, doesn't want what you're offering, but there's a part of me that's like, I really get it. I really get it.
Yeah.
Like if I didn't have a strong sense that I would be missing who God's called me to be if I wasn't in a church regularly.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go either. I wouldn't.
What would you say to somebody who's just starting? Now, from the perspective that you have being almost 12 years in, what encouragement would you give to them out of your experience?
Oh, I don't know. I think that might be somewhat dependent on the person.
Yeah, it would be.
I think an important part for me that I don't think I realized was how costly it would be for my family to be a member of the clergy, and I think I felt like that was part of the reason that there was motivation to do a church plant, was that we felt like, well, it'd be great to be able to do a church where there's no pressure on the spouse, no pressure on the kids. The problem is that we're ministering in a culture where there's just a lot of underlying cultural assumptions.
Yeah.
People would come and visit the church and say, hey, we want to meet you and your wife to talk about how we could fit in the church. It's like, oh, you want to meet me and my wife? Like, I guarantee you she doesn't want to have a conversation about how you could fit in the church. I don't know that I do anymore either,
Yeah.
So the assumptions that people make that are just, it's just rough. It's rough.
Yeah.
And so I think I said one time in a prayer meeting, and boy, one pastor in particular got real upset about it. But I said, I wonder if there's something to considering whether a call to ministry and church planting might also be a call to like celibate singleness and just serving the Lord. And maybe there's something to the church being your family and the parishioners being your children, and, the whole Catholic model. So I would certainly say to a young person considering a call to ministry to consider whether or not that might be a part of it. At the same time, nothing's taught me more about who God is than my marriage. Nothing's taught me more about the Father's heart than having kids myself. And so I don't, what do I know? But I would encourage someone to at least consider it.
I would encourage you. You do know some stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
You're at an awkward place, I think, in some ways, because you've got through some really hard stuff and made it to the other side. Now what? What do I want to do for the next 10 years, 20 years? Who do I want to be, and what do I want to be like? Have I learned anything about myself, and how can I continue to grow in those things that I'm evolving in even right now? So I think you have a lot to offer. I've gained a lot just sitting here having this conversation with you, James. We do this frequently over at Keebler, over coffee. And it's just, the thing I like about you is And it's going to sound, it maybe sound patronizing a bit, but I like the fact that you're not me. I like the fact that you think differently, that you're from a different generation, which causes you to filter things differently. And I'm like, I wouldn't know that unless I asked you. I wouldn't know that unless we had the conversation. So, and then the same thing is true of you sitting down with somebody who's just now getting the guts to plant a church or doing something like going into ministry. And there's a few people in town that are like that. And I think you do have something to offer them, not necessarily to cheer them on. They don't need a cheerleader. I think what we need is friends who can understand us, who can understand some of the dynamics that we walk through. So I appreciate who you are. I hope you don't stop doing this just because I don't know who I'd have coffee with on Wednesday mornings. So I'm glad you're doing it. I'm glad what you bring to the table is something really valuable. I think that's true of most of the guys that I've met, though. You know, there are some people who are into it because it's a job, and that's kind of sad. But not very many. Most of the guys that are pastoring churches, at least in the Cowlitz County, are doing it because they can't not do it, at least at this place.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're welcome. I do think one thing I would say, and I've said this to people starting ministries in the community or planting churches in the community who've come along after I did. I think it's so healthy to be connected to and to get involved in things that aren't your thing, right?
Yeah.
And there's just something about the way the kingdom works where when we as kingdom people will engage with the people who are running a ministry that's not our ministry, but we'll support them. We'll send money their way. We'll encourage volunteers to go there. Or when we as the church are willing to link arms with another congregation who maybe they don't sing the same songs as us, or maybe they have different ideas about, this or that. But when we're willing to do it together, I think there's so much power in that. And it just seems to be the way that God's Spirit wants his people to minister. And so that's usually the piece of advice I try to throw out there.
I think that's good advice. I think we should keep doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your friendship, and the best to you and Renewal.
Oh, thanks.
In the
Likewise.
days ahead.